России продолжается ожесточенный спор о...
A heated debate regarding Russia's recent past, the 90s, is taking place within Russian society. The last decade of the 20th century marked Russia's attempt to transform into a democracy following the collapse of the Soviet Union. What went wrong and how Russia ended up where it is now has been a long debated topic, and Maria Pavchik, Alexei Navalny's key ally, proposed her own resolution by making an appropriately titled video series, Traitors. In this series, Pavchik essentially assigned blame to the de facto leaders of post-communist Russia, including oligarchs such as the deceased Boris Berezovsky and Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In 2001, David Hoffman published a monumental work titled The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia. Later, a Russian translation of the book was published. Hoffman served as the Moscow bureau chief of the Washington Post for 6 years, and in his book he explained how Russian capitalism was created when, quote, there was lawlessness and lying and theft were considered business as usual. The oligarchs seized the opportunity which presented itself because the government was inept. Then the government had its revenge. The oligarchs implied are the already mentioned Khodorkovsky, Moscow Mayor Lushkov, top official Chubais, media moguls Berezovsky and Gusinsky, and banker Smolensky, 6 figures. While working on his book, Hoffman interviewed more than 200 people. His book became a bestseller and to this day is considered among the most accurate depictions of the events of the 90s, the decade that doubtlessly played a large role in the way things are today. The author, David Hoffman, is joining us for a conversation right now. Greetings, David.
Hi.
It's good to see you, and first of all, I would like to ask you to give a somewhat brief description of that unique time period in Russian history. I'm sure you're aware that debates regarding the legacy of the 90s have been reignited. How would you describe this time period?
Well, I wrote a book about it, and I concluded from all that research, and also I lived in Russia from 95 until 2001. I concluded a couple of things. First of all, I think this was the longest period of freedom, of real freedom, that Russians have enjoyed in 1,000 years of their history. And they should regard it as a precious thing that they had. Boris Yeltsin, who led Russia in this time, was a champion of this idea of freedom, but he was more interested in tearing down the big state of communism than he was in building democracy and markets. I think there are real missed opportunities when it came to building the new Russia. And in particular, Yeltsin decided to have the maximum amount of freedom first and build the rules and the laws and the institutions later. And everybody paid a price for that. It took a lot longer than people expected. And I would say, finally, this problem of expectations was very real. Russians thought that change would come faster. It takes a long time to build capitalism and democracy after 70 years of communist system, and it didn't happen quickly enough.
Да, я понимаю. Согласны ли вы с тем, что...
I understand. Would you agree that the oligarchs whom you focused on in your book are at fault for Russia missing the chance to democratize? That they are the main people responsible for Vladimir Putin's rise to power?
Приход к власти Владимира Путина.
Well, first of all, Vladimir Putin was handpicked by Boris Yeltsin. And I think ultimately Yeltsin regretted that decision. He said so. So I don't think that anybody else but Boris Nikolaevich should be blamed. The oligarchs were definitely supporting Yeltsin at that time, and I think Boris Abramovich Berezovsky did play a role in Putin's selection, but he didn't do it alone.
Ну, тут, естественно...
Right, but now we are reminded of the presidential election of 1996 when Boris Yeltsin was almost certain to lose, yet he prevailed in the end, and that was in no small way thanks to the aforementioned oligarchs' efforts. Is that something that could be considered betrayal in your opinion, or a crime against the Russian people? How did you see it back then, and how do you see it now?
Election 1996 was an existential moment for the hopes of Russians for a democratic free market future. Gennady Zyuganov was not going to bring them a democratic market future. And I think that this was a scary time. Yeltsin was ill. He was the only leader really that could take Russia forward at that time. And A lot of people compromised a little bit on principles because they faced an existential moment. And I believe then, and I still believe, that Zyuganov would not have taken Russia toward democracy. And so to save whatever had been built in those early years, the oligarchs swung in to help Yeltsin, and they also benefited enormously in the loans for shares deal, which was an essential part of what happened around the 96 election. Some people say that this compromise that was made in order to get Yeltsin reelected, really stained the whole democratic experience. But I do believe that everybody involved at the time felt that if they didn't do that, if they let Zyuganov go on, and he was leading in the polls, then the brief experience, the one that began in 91 and the one that began with Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, would be over. So that's what I mean about existential. It was a very, very difficult time. Everything was on the line.
Скажите,
Did you ever contemplate the question which is worse, the 90s or the 2020s for Russia? The 2020s, when Vladimir Putin has waged a war in Ukraine and everything else that is going on, while simultaneously it appears that the standard of living among Russians has risen, so it is far from things were during the chaotic 90s, which some people still fear to this day.
I think your question is way off the mark. And I think anybody that lived through the 90s, it was a difficult and tumultuous time. By the way, do you think that the Soviet Union was a terrific place to live in? People were eager to put that experience of the Soviet police state, of equality and poverty, to put that experience behind them. My experience was that Russians were eager to live in the new and somewhat unpredictable period of change of the 90s. And, at that time, anybody could get on a plane and fly to anywhere in the world that they wanted to. Freedom to travel was very important. You could stand out on Red Square with a placard and say, "Down with Boris Nikolaevich," and nobody would bother you. You could write freely in all the newspapers and magazines, and you would not be censored. So I feel that this period of freedom is sometimes now forgotten, but it was much, much better for Russia than a period of censorship, war, and dictatorship, which is where we are today.
не поймите меня неправильно, я как раз...
Please don't get me wrong, I'm not a person that can afford to protest on the Red Square. I'm a person that is forced to live in exile. My question was largely about the people who are uncertain of their attitude towards that time period. In an interview about 15 years ago, you said that the problem of all oil-rich countries is that their societies are plagued with apathy. Once people are able to afford a new car or a new house, they stop wanting anything to change. If there is too much wealth, the country falls into a slumber. Oil is a drug. Would you say that Russia is asleep right now?
I don't remember that, but there's some truth to it that countries get stuck on these oil revenues and they don't diversify. Russia should have diversified into other things that had an enormous human capital in Russia, some of the most brilliant mathematicians and scientists in the world. Why is it that oil became the single most important export of Russia and not the brains of and the smarts of people? Why is it that there wasn't another boom in software? Why is it that Facebook was invented in America and not in Russia? It could have been. So there are a lot of missed opportunities, partly because oil was so dominant. And in Yeltsin's time, one of his failures was the failure to diversify.
My last question is about the main characters of your book, the oligarchs, who had a massive influence on the state of the country in the 90s. What is your personal opinion of them? Do you sympathize with them, or are you critical of them, or did they strike you as naive? How do you feel about your main characters?
As I wrote in my book, to establish capitalism and democracy on the ashes of a ruined system, it doesn't happen overnight. It's an evolutionary process, which means it gradually changes and hopefully for the better. The people that really started to build the new Russia, Yeltsin, Gaidar, Chubais, they had a faith that if they provided the maximum freedom first, then all the other things would follow. If they gave the oligarchs the chance to start businesses, some would fail, some would succeed, some would become rich, and some would go bankrupt. This idea of free competition was the center of the whole premise. And I look at these guys as the first phase in the evolution. It was going to change. It was already changing in 1999 toward more Western accounting, toward different kinds of corporate governance. Some of the abuses were ending, but at the beginning, it was a wild time. And as I said, Yeltsin failed to create a rule of law state. He wanted maximum freedom first. So the oligarchs rose in a period of lawlessness when there was really no law. Don't forget, the Soviet system outlawed entrepreneurship. Now, to change that, Yeltsin needed not only to allow it, but also to regulate it. He never got that far. He simply allowed it in a time of maximum freedom. The oligarchs were a symptom of this thing that Yeltsin unleashed and never finished.
Что ж, большое вам спасибо.
Thank you very much, and I hope we can continue this large discussion sometime later with more time in our hands. This has been David Hoffman, contributing editor at The Washington Post, writer and author of the book The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia.